Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Here's a question to begin with. What if the purpose of life wasn't happiness, but suffering? Not as punishment, not as a flaw, but as a quiet law beneath everything. That's what Arthur Schopenhauer believed. That pain, not pleasure, was the engine of human existence, and yet buried inside this dark vision was something strangely hopeful, something beautiful. Tonight we're going to enter that idea, not to fear it, but to understand it. Because Schopenhauer's philosophy isn't just gloom for its own sake, it's a mirror, a way of seeing human nature, honestly, without illusions. And in that honesty, there's a kind of peace. But first, the pain. Schopenhauer didn't invent pessimism, but he made it poetic, almost sacred. Born in 1788, he was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhism and Hinduism. He read the Upanishads by candlelight. He admired the calm of the East, the detachment, the stillness, but he was also grounded in the Western tradition, Plato, Kant, the Greeks. And what he saw in both was something most people try not to see. That existence is full of longing. Hunger, lust, fear, boredom. Moment to moment, the human condition is ruled by what Schopenhauer called the will, a blind, irrational force that drives every living thing. It isn't conscious, it doesn't care, it just wants, and that wanting never stops. We crave food, sex, safety, success, but the moment we get them, the pleasure fades. We fall back into boredom, into new desires. The cycle starts again. Wanting, striving, failing, or succeeding, and then realizing we still feel empty. For Schopenhauer, this wasn't a glitch in life. It was life, the essence of it. He wrote, "All striving springs from want or deficiency, from dissatisfaction with one's condition, and is therefore suffering so long as it is not satisfied. But no satisfaction is lasting." It sounds bleak, and it is, but isn't it also familiar? Haven't we all chased something, thinking it would fix everything, only to feel the same quiet ache afterward? The promotion, the relationship, the number on the scale. It's not that joy is impossible, but it's fleeting. And Schopenhauer's point isn't to say we should despair. His point is that by seeing this clearly, we can stop being fooled. The world sells us happiness like a drug. Every ad, every product, every dream is packaged as if it will end our craving. But nothing does, not permanently. And so, we suffer. Silently. Repeatedly. He compared life to a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. In pain, we suffer because we lack something. In boredom, we suffer because we have nothing to strive for. It's a trap, a loop. But strangely, Schopenhauer didn't hate the world. He found beauty in its tragedy. He saw art and music as escapes, not because they lie, but because they momentarily silence the will. A haunting melody, a painting that makes time stop. These are moments when we forget ourselves, we forget the craving, we just exist. And that's the hidden hope. Not a big solution, not salvation, but small, soft moments of transcendence, like sitting beside someone in silence and feeling known, or watching rain hit the window and thinking of nothing at all. There's a Japanese word, mono no aware, the awareness of the impermanence of things, a gentle sadness at how fleeting everything is. Schopenhauer lived in that space. He believed the wise person didn't chase pleasure, but quieted the will, through reflection, through solitude, through kindness even. Yes, kindness, because if all life suffers, then compassion becomes sacred. To Schopenhauer, ethics wasn't about rules or God. It was about recognizing the shared pain of existence. To hurt another is to amplify the will. To help is to soften it. He once wrote, "Compassion is the basis of morality. Not duty, not logic, just a deep intuitive understanding that others feel like we do." And yet, he was famously cold in real life. He kept to himself, had few friends, quarrelled with his mother, pushed people away. Like many thinkers, his ideas were purer than his actions, but that doesn't make them untrue. If anything, it makes them more human. Because Schopenhauer wasn't selling a perfect life. He was admitting that life hurts and trying to find dignity in that fact. He saw the madness of optimism, the cruelty of empty hope. He saw people constantly disappointed, constantly confused about why happiness slipped through their fingers. And instead of denying it, he embraced it. Like a doctor who doesn't lie about the illness, but tells you gently, it's going to hurt. But you're not alone. One of his strangest insights is about love. He said love is the will's cruelest trick. We think we fall in love because of compatibility or connection, but really, it's the will pushing us to reproduce. It doesn't care about our happiness. It only cares that we continue the species. So we fall for people who trigger ancient instincts, and then sometimes suffer in those relationships, or feel empty afterward, or wonder why the passion fades. It's not romantic, but is it wrong? Modern evolutionary psychology echoes this idea. That attraction isn't about the soul. It's about biology, algorithms of survival dressed up as poetry. This doesn't mean love isn't real, but it suggests it's not what we think, not always. And once again, Schopenhauer isn't trying to ruin things. He's asking us to see clearly, to stop chasing ghosts, to stop expecting the world to fix us. Because once we understand the will, we can resist it, not completely, but enough to live more honestly, more gently. We can stop needing everything to feel good all the time. We can make peace with stillness, with not getting what we want, with letting go. And in that space, something shifts. It's not joy exactly, but something quieter, something steadier, a kind of inner silence. Nietzsche hated Schopenhauer's pessimism. He called it life-denying, but even Nietzsche started as his admirer. He wrote that reading Schopenhauer felt like hearing the truth for the first time. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, later wrote that meaning could exist even in suffering, that life isn't about feeling good, but about choosing how to respond to pain. That idea, so close to Schopenhauer's, has helped millions, and it begins with honesty. Life isn't easy. It's not supposed to be, but that doesn't make it meaningless. Sometimes it makes it more meaningful, because when we stop expecting life to comfort us, we can start comforting each other. When we stop demanding answers, we can begin to listen. Schopenhauer taught that wisdom begins with suffering, but it doesn't have to end there. The will may be blind, but we are not. And in that awareness, in that flicker of freedom, is the beginning of something like hope. The strange thing about suffering is that no one escapes it, yet everyone believes, in some secret way, that they were meant to, as if pain is some personal failure, a detour from how life was supposed to go. Schopenhauer knew better. He said suffering isn't a side effect of life. It is life. To be alive is to want, and to want is to hurt. This wasn't despair. It was precision. He wasn't trying to make people miserable. He was trying to free them from the exhausting chase of happiness. Because what if the real torment isn't suffering itself, but the belief that it shouldn't be happening? The moment that illusion breaks, something new can grow in its place, not joy perhaps, but lucidity. And sometimes, lucidity is enough. Schopenhauer didn't romanticize struggle. He didn't believe it always led to strength or virtue. He saw pain for what it was, raw, indifferent, stupid. He saw animals devouring each other without pity. He saw humans manipulating, exploiting, hungering for more, even when they already had too much. He saw the same pattern everywhere, the will, always wanting, never satisfied. And he believed this will wasn't just in people, it was in all of nature, in the tree straining towards sunlight, in the wolf chasing prey, in the child screaming for attention, in the millionaire who still feels poor. We're not rational, he said. We're not moral. We're not noble. We are puppets of this blind force. And yet knowing that, we can begin to resist. That's the strange twist in his thought. By recognizing the will, we can step outside it. Not entirely, but just enough. It's like hearing the hum of a machine you never noticed before. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. You start to notice when the will is pulling your strings, the craving for praise, the need to win, the rush toward distraction, and with that awareness comes a choice, to indulge it or to observe it. Schopenhauer himself tried to live that way. He never married. He avoided fame. He lived quietly, surrounded by books and silence. But he wasn't peaceful. He was bitter, impatient, often cruel. He argued with strangers. He pushed a woman down the stairs once and later wrote that she had it coming. His philosophy was clear, but his life was messy, like most people, and maybe that's the point. We are not theories, we are contradictions. We believe in kindness and snap at waiters. We crave solitude and dread loneliness. We love and resent the same person. Schopenhauer understood this. He didn't demand purity. He demanded honesty. And that's why his work still matters. Because beneath all the cold logic is a warm, quiet truth. That we're all suffering and trying not to show it. The will doesn't care if we succeed or fail. It only cares that we keep chasing, that we never stop. But what happens when we do stop? When we sit still, not out of laziness, but out of clarity? That's where art comes in. For Schopenhauer, art was the highest escape, music especially. He believed music was pure will, stripped of all form, speaking directly to the soul. A minor key, a rising crescendo, a single sustained note. These weren't just sounds, they were expressions of the will itself. But unlike desire, which hurts, music soothes. It doesn't ask for anything, it just is. And in that, it offers a glimpse of what life could be if we stopped wanting. Not dead, not numb, just still. There's a strange peace in this idea. In a world obsessed with growth, progress, hustle, Schopenhauer whispers something different. Rest. Not because you've earned it, but because the chase is a lie. Because satisfaction is a mirage. Because the moment you get what you want, the wanting returns. He saw people spend their entire lives trying to be happy, only to realize, near the end, that they had only ever been busy. So he proposed another path. Not optimism, not faith, but withdrawal, like the sages of the East, like the monk who leaves the city, like the hermit who finds joy in tending a garden no one sees. Not because they are running away, but because they see the world more clearly than most. Schopenhauer was fascinated by asceticism, the deliberate denial of pleasure, not as punishment, but as liberation. The less you want, the less you suffer. The fewer attachments, the fewer wounds. It's a radical idea in a culture that worships abundance, but it has echoes everywhere. In the quiet monk, in the recovering addict, in the minimalist who owns 30 things and feels full, in the writer who deletes everything except what matters. It's not about misery, it's about focus, simplicity, silence. The will wants noise, wants friction, wants you always reaching. Schopenhauer says, stop, just stop, and see what remains. Maybe that's the beginning of real peace, not triumph, not pleasure, but the absence of craving. A stillness so deep it feels like freedom. Of course, not everyone agrees. Nietzsche found Schopenhauer's denial of life unbearable. He called him a preacher of weakness, said he was afraid to embrace the chaos, the madness, the violence of living fully. Nietzsche wanted people to say yes to life, to affirm every moment, even the suffering. Amor fati, the love of fate. But even he began with Schopenhauer. Even he needed the shadow to find the flame. And maybe that's what Schopenhauer offers best. Not the last word, but the first truth. The raw, unvarnished reality that life is not built for ease. That pain is not failure. That craving is not meaning. And once we accept that, we can begin to choose. To suffer consciously. To live gently. To reach for beauty. Not as a fix, but as a gesture. A kindness. A soft rebellion against the will. Like a poet writing for no one. Like a gardener planting seeds that may never bloom. Like a stranger holding the door for someone who will never remember. These moments matter, not because they solve anything, but because they rise above the logic of the will. They are not about survival. They are about something quieter, something sacred. Maybe that is the hidden hope, not that life gets easier, but that we become more graceful in carrying its weight. Schopenhauer didn't promise relief, but he offered understanding, and sometimes that's more powerful, because when you understand the game, you stop playing by its rules. You stop chasing happiness like a ghost. You stop thinking pain means something's gone wrong. You begin to see it as the air we breathe, unavoidable, but not unbearable. Not if we stop resisting, not if we sit with it. Let it pass through. Let it teach us how to see more clearly. The will is strong, but awareness is stronger. And in that awareness, we find something like stillness, something like grace, something like hope. Schopenhauer once said that life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom, and those who've truly watched their own days unfold in quiet honesty will know how accurate that feels. Pain arrives uninvited, raw and overwhelming, but boredom creeps in slower, disguised as restlessness, fatigue, or that heavy silence that settles in when nothing new is pulling the strings of desire. Most people rush to escape it. They flood the silence with noise, the stillness with movement, the emptiness with distraction. But for Schopenhauer, boredom wasn't a trivial nuisance. It was proof of the same thing pain revealed, that the will to live is never satisfied. Even in comfort, even in safety, even when everything is okay, we ache. We ache because the will demands constant friction, constant longing. And when that longing has nothing to latch onto, it turns inward. It gnaws at itself. That's boredom, the discontent of a soul with nothing to chase. And so the world provides distractions, infinite in variety, but hollow in weight. Entertainment, ambition, relationships, status symbols, but each one is just another mask for the same force. The will dressed up in weekend plans and bucket lists. Think of modern life. The endless scroll, the late-night anxiety, the desperate need to be seen, admired, envied. It's the same cycle Schopenhauer saw in 19th century salons and drawing rooms. The technology has changed, the hunger has not. And yet, even as he criticized the world, Schopenhauer admired those rare individuals who managed to step outside of it. He called them geniuses, not in the sense of IQ or talent, but in the deeper sense of someone who sees through the illusion. The artist who creates not to sell, but to capture a fleeting truth. The monk who renounces desire, not out of fear, but out of clarity. The thinker who retreats from applause to cultivate silence. These people weren't superior. They were just awake. They saw the machinery behind the curtain. They understood that the pleasure of life is almost always borrowed against future pain, that every high invites a low, that every possession becomes a burden. But instead of collapsing under that knowledge, they built something from it, a life of fewer cravings, a mind of deeper peace. It's not about perfection, it's about resistance, a gentle rebellion against the tyranny of the will. And that rebellion often begins with a question. What if I didn't want so much? Not as an act of moral virtue, but as an experiment in liberation. What if I stopped chasing things that never stay? What if I sat with the boredom instead of numbing it? What if I let pain be pain without trying to escape it? These aren't easy questions. The will fights back. It whispers, don't you want more? Don't you deserve better? Aren't you falling behind? And that's where most people surrender. Not because they're weak, but because the world is loud and the truth is quiet. Schopenhauer's truth is whisper soft. It doesn't seduce, it doesn't flatter, it invites, like a cold wind through an open window, bracing, uncomfortable, but honest. And in that honesty, there's something oddly comforting, because when you see suffering as the default, you stop taking it personally. You stop asking, why me? And start asking now, what? That's the shift, from resistance to observation, from clinging to letting go. Schopenhauer was skeptical of the modern obsession with progress. He He saw it as just another mask for the will. More machines, more cities, more complexity, but not more peace, not more clarity, not more being. He didn't believe in utopias, he believed in moments, a melody, a walk, a sentence that says what no one else dares to say. That's what he offered. Not a map, but a mirror. And in that mirror, we see our own longing reflected back at us. Not as weakness, but as the human condition. He would have found today's world overwhelming. The pace, the noise, the endless performance, and yet he would have recognized the pattern immediately. Because beneath the digital facade, the same ancient will still burns, the same thirst dressed in new rituals. The philosopher Alain de Botton once wrote that we suffer because we hope. And hope, in Schopenhauer's view, is often just disguised craving. It promises a future where the will finally be satisfied. But it never is. Hope can be a drug, a trap, a delay. That doesn't mean we should give up, but maybe we should hope differently. Not for escape, but for awareness. Not for ease, but for insight. And insight always begins with discomfort. That's the paradox. The more we resist suffering, the more it controls us. But when we face it, name it, even welcome it, something softens, something releases, the grip loosens, and we start to see that our suffering is not unique. It's not proof of failure, it's the thread that connects us to each other, to the world, to truth. Schopenhauer's compassion didn't come from sentiment, it came from seeing clearly. If all life suffers, then kindness is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's a way of saying, I see your pain, I see my own. Let's not add to it, let's not pretend it isn't there. Let's make space for it, quietly, honestly. That's the essence of his ethics. Not commandments, but compassion. Not doctrine, but recognition. He believed that cruelty comes from blindness, from people trapped in the illusion that they're separate, superior, immune. But when we see ourselves in the other, we soften, we help. Not because it's right, but because it's real. Because it eases the ache, even for a moment. And in those moments, something changes, not the world, but us. We stop being tools of the will, we become its witness, its poet, its gentle adversary. That's the beauty hidden in Schopenhauer's darkness. Not that suffering ends, but that it reveals. It strips away the unnecessary. It teaches us what matters. A quiet room, an honest word, a shared silence. These things are not dramatic, but they are sacred. Because they ask for nothing, they simply are. And in their presence, the will retreats. Just for a while. Just long enough to breathe. That's all he ever promised. And maybe that's enough. There is a kind of sadness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream or sob. It sits quietly behind the eyes, beneath the routine, inside the ordinary rhythm of daily life. It's the kind of sadness Schopenhauer wrote about, not as a temporary emotion, but as the default undercurrent of existence, a low hum of dissatisfaction that follows us from one desire to the next. He believed that this melancholy wasn't a flaw in the system, but the system itself. The will, always wanting, always restless, can never rest for long. Even in moments of joy, it waits just beyond the frame, watching, waiting for the thrill to fade. And it always does. That's the cruelty of pleasure. It turns on us. What we once longed for becomes dull, then ordinary, then burdensome. The new car becomes a monthly payment. The exciting lover becomes a person, with needs, flaws, silences. The dream job becomes a routine. And so we seek again. Not because we are greedy, but because we are wired to never be full. Schopenhauer saw this as tragic, but also strangely freeing. If nothing satisfies forever, then we can stop pretending that it should. We can begin to seek meaning, not through accumulation, but through understanding. And what we understand, we begin to accept, not with resignation, with clarity, but that clarity often arrives wrapped in despair. It feels like loss, but it's a letting go. The letting go of false promises, of cultural myths, of the exhausting pressure to be happy all the time. That pressure, Schopenhauer believed, is part of the illusion, the lie that life is meant to fulfill us. He called this lie dangerous because it makes suffering feel like failure. But suffering isn't failure, it's human. And when we face it with open eyes, we stop being its victim. We become its interpreter, its observer, its soft witness. He wrote that the wise person sees through the veil of desire, that they stop expecting life to deliver something it never promised, that they find peace not in more, but in less. Less noise, less craving, less distraction. This isn't apathy, it's focus. It's the deliberate act of turning away from the carnival of craving and towards something quieter, something steadier. Think of the moments that felt most real, most profound. They were probably not when everything was going well. They were when something broke, something cracked, and for a second the truth slipped through. A breakup that made time feel like water. A loss that hollowed out the day and left behind something raw. A failure that stripped away the mask. These moments hurt, but they also revealed. And that's the strange gift of suffering. It removes the unnecessary. It humbles. It clarifies. And Schopenhauer believed that if we can see that clearly, if we can sit with it long enough, we stop being so afraid. Not because we grow stronger, but because we stop needing to win. We stop needing life to be fair. We stop needing things to go our way. And in that surrender, something unexpected appears. Serenity. Not the joy of victory, not the thrill of success, but the calm of not needing either. It's not glamorous. It won't make headlines, but it's real. And realness in a world of illusion is radical. Schopenhauer also wrote about death, not to fear it, but to understand it. He saw death not as an interruption, but as a return to the state before we were born, a state without pain, without desire. He believed that the will continues through us, but we ourselves are temporary expressions of it. Like waves on the surface of the sea. When a wave dies, the water doesn't disappear, it returns to stillness. This too can be comforting, because if death is a release from the will, then it's not a punishment. It's a relief, a silence at the end of noise. Of course we grieve, we fear, we cling. That's natural, that's the will in motion. But if we can look past the panic, we might see something beautiful. Not in death itself, but in the way it strips away the unimportant. When someone dies, we remember not their achievements, but their presence, their eyes, their laughter, their strange habits, their silences. We remember the realness, not the resume. That too is part of Schopenhauer's message, that what matters is not what we accomplish, but how deeply we understand, how gently we live, how clearly we see. This doesn't mean we should stop living. On the contrary, it means we should live without illusion, without the constant expectation that life owes us something, without the fear that suffering is proof we did something wrong. Schopenhauer believed that understanding the will allowed us to step just slightly outside of it, to become the painter instead of the paint, to become the one who watches the craving instead of being consumed by it. That's the beginning of inner freedom, not control, but space to breathe, to reflect, to choose differently. And yes, it's hard. The will doesn't give up easily. It whispers through every commercial, every social feed, every comparison. It tells us we're not enough, that we need more, that if we just fix one more thing, then everything will finally click. That's the lie, and it's powerful, but it's still a lie. Schopenhauer's truth is quiet, uncomfortable, but strangely kind, because it gives us permission to stop, to rest, to sit in the pain without flinching, to see through the boredom, to let go of the illusion that something out there will finally complete us. Nothing will, and yet everything changes when we stop needing it to. Then even ordinary moments begin to shine. A soft breeze, the sound of a clock, a familiar voice saying nothing in particular. These things aren't spectacular, but they are enough, more than enough, because they are real, and the real is always sacred. Schopenhauer didn't want followers. He wanted thinkers. He wanted people to see clearly, feel deeply, live gently. He knew that his message would be misunderstood, dismissed as gloomy or cold. But he also knew that for those willing to sit in the dark, a deeper light would appear. Not the blinding light of answers, but the soft glow of awareness. The light that comes from knowing what you are and what you're not. From seeing the will and choosing moment by moment not to obey it blindly. That choice is the beginning of wisdom. And perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of peace. Some people carry their suffering like a secret. It doesn't show in their voice or face, but it lingers in how they pause before speaking, in how their eyes scan a room, not for joy, but for threat. Schopenhauer would have noticed those details, not because he romanticized pain, but because he believed it was the only honest starting point. He didn't trust cheerfulness. He saw it as the gloss of denial, a performance meant to distract from the gnawing truth that nothing stays, nothing satisfies, and nothing is quite what we thought it would be. And yet, this wasn't nihilism. It was precision. He wanted to cut through the illusion, strip away the polish, get to the raw engine that drives people, desire, fear, hunger, vanity, the will in its endless disguises. But once that's seen clearly, the question changes. If everything we chase ends in loss or boredom, why do we keep chasing? And if we stop, what's left? That question is where Schopenhauer turns from despair to something quieter. Not hope, exactly, but insight. Because when you realize that every desire is a leash, you start to let go. You stop needing life to thrill you. You stop needing others to approve. You begin to settle into a different rhythm, a slower one built on observation instead of reaction. Most people live reactively. They move from stimulus to stimulus, pulled by the urgency of the moment. But Schopenhauer invites something else, stillness, not withdrawal, but awareness, a kind of sacred detachment. He wasn't the first to say this, the Stoics said it too. Epictetus taught that what disturbs us is not events, but our judgments about them. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the universe is change, and our life is what our thoughts make it. But where Stoicism encouraged discipline, Schopenhauer asked for surrender. Not to the world, but to truth. The truth that we are not in control of much, that we are carried more than we carry, that our strength is often a mask for fear, and that real peace comes not from power, but from seeing power for what it is, temporary, hollow, fragile. He compared life to a dream we're only half awake in. Most people stumble through it, reacting, consuming, panicking. But the philosopher, the artist, the one who suffers deeply and reflects quietly, they begin to wake. And what they see first is not beauty, it's absurdity. The cruelty of ambition, the emptiness of fame, the sick joke of wanting something for years only to find it didn't change anything. And yet, in that absurdity, a strange tenderness appears. Because once the veil drops, you can stop performing. You can be real, with yourself, with others. You can speak in quieter tones. You can laugh at the madness instead of being crushed by it. You can sit in silence without fearing it. That's not depression, that's depth. That's where Schopenhauer lived. In the deep end, he believed that life, at its core, is a kind of suffering, but that by understanding it, we don't collapse, we transcend. Not by escaping pain, but by accepting it as the rhythm of the world, and then using it as material, as insight, as a way to see others more clearly. Because if suffering is universal, then so is empathy. And from empathy, real connection can grow. Not the performative connection of small talk and social media, but the kind that says, I know what it's like to hurt for no reason. I know what it's like to feel everything at once and nothing at all. I know the ache of being alive, and in that space something opens, a softness, a silence, a shared recognition. Schopenhauer didn't believe in redemption through success. He didn't think people became better by winning. He thought people became better when they suffered consciously and allowed that suffering to dissolve their illusions. He saw cruelty as ignorance, people so consumed by their own pain that they lash out, manipulate, use. But he also saw compassion as clarity, the moment you realize that everyone is struggling with something invisible, that everyone is carrying a weight they didn't choose. And when you know that, truly know it, kindness stops being an effort. It becomes instinct. A soft hand on the shoulder, a quiet gesture of presence, a refusal to judge too quickly. That's what he meant by ethical living. Not rules, not virtue, just a refusal to deepen the suffering of others. Even when it's easy, even when it's justified, even when it feels good. Because that pleasure too is the will. Always pushing for more, always demanding victory. And victory, Schopenhauer warned, is always temporary. Today's winner is tomorrow's forgotten name. Today's triumph is tomorrow's regret. The only lasting thing is the way we saw, the way we understood, the way we carried our pain, and the way we refused to multiply it. That's the quiet heroism in Schopenhauer's view. Not the warrior, not the winner, but the witness, the one who sees clearly and chooses not to harm, even when they could, especially when they could. And this isn't weakness, it's strength of a rarer kind. The strength to endure without illusion, the strength to say no when the will says yes, the strength to let go when every instinct screams to hold tighter. He once wrote that the happiest person is not the one who has the most, but the one who needs the least. And needing less isn't about deprivation, it's about freedom. The freedom to wake up without panic, to sit alone without needing a screen, to love without clinging, to grieve without collapsing. That's not coldness, that's clarity. And clarity in a world of noise is sacred. Schopenhauer's life was far from perfect. He was angry, isolated, often bitter, but his writing offered something rare, truth without anesthesia. And for those willing to sit with that truth, something shifts. The world doesn't get easier, but it gets quieter. And in that quiet, we begin to hear ourselves. Not the version trained by culture or fear, but the deeper voice, the one that asks, what if I stopped pretending? What if I let go of the chase? What if I lived more gently, more honestly, more simply? Those questions don't have easy answers, but asking them is the beginning of something sacred, something Schopenhauer gave us, not through his happiness, but through his pain. A kind of roadmap, not out of suffering, but through it, with eyes open, with hearts soft, with fewer illusions and more light. Some truths arrive slowly, like water finding its way through stone, and Schopenhauer's deepest truth may be this: the more we want from life, the more life hurts us. Not because wanting is bad, but because wanting is endless. It multiplies like cells dividing, like weeds in a garden. A little desire leads to another. A fulfilled wish births a dozen more. And so we live not in satisfaction, but in pursuit. Always chasing, always reaching, always haunted by what we don't yet have. That is the mechanism of the will. And Schopenhauer saw it not only in philosophy, but everywhere. In biology, in art, in history, in the restless eyes of people pretending to be calm. He saw it in animals clawing for food, in lovers craving each other only to grow distant once the thrill passed, in kings and peasants alike dreaming of something more, something next, something else. And he asked, if this wanting never ends, what kind of life is that? What kind of peace can survive in a world built on hunger? Most people don't ask those questions. They don't want to, because to ask them is to see through the mask. And to see through the mask is to recognize how much of what we call joy is just relief from pain. Temporary, shallow, fading relief. The meal tastes good because we were hungry. The compliment lifts us because we were insecure. The vacation feels magical because we were bored. But then the hunger returns, the insecurity returns, the boredom returns, and the chase begins again. This cycle, Schopenhauer believed, is not a fault of culture or society or childhood. It is the structure of life itself. The will does not care about fulfillment. It only cares about continuation. And so, we breed, we consume, we distract, and we suffer. But some, he believed, can escape. Not by changing the world, but by changing how they see it. This is the core of his liberation. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from illusion. And that illusion takes many forms. One of them is romantic love. Schopenhauer was almost surgical in his dissection of it. He said love is nature's trick to get us to reproduce. We think we fall for someone because of beauty, or character, or soul connection. But what we really fall for, he claimed, are traits that signal reproductive fitness. Hips, strength, symmetry, health. It isn't personal. It isn't even conscious. It's the will. And when the will gets what it wants, offspring, it often abandons us. The love fades. The passion dies. The illusion collapses. And we are left wondering why something that felt divine now feels empty. This is not the stuff of fairy tales, but it is honest. And in that honesty, there is power. Because if love is a function of the will, then perhaps the disillusionment that follows it isn't a tragedy. It's a wake-up call. A reminder that we were never meant to be satisfied. Not by another person, not permanently. And if we know that, maybe we can love differently. Not with the desperation to be completed, but with the clarity that says, I see you. I don't need you to fix me. I don't need you to save me. I want you, but I don't expect you to be the answer. That kind of love is quieter, less intoxicating, but it lasts longer. It survives the crash of the fantasy, because it wasn't built on illusion. Schopenhauer didn't say we shouldn't love. He said we should see what love really is. And when we do, it becomes less about possession and more about presence, less about filling a hole and more about witnessing a life. That shift is everything. It's the difference between clinging and holding, between needing and sharing, between suffering and understanding. He wrote, "Mostly it is loss which teaches us about the worth of things." And perhaps that is why love hurts so much, because it forces us to confront what the will wants most and what it can never fully keep. We want permanence, we get impermanence, we want union, we get separation, we want certainty, we get change. And this too is part of Schopenhauer's vision. The world is not made to fit our expectations. It moves on its own terms, it gives and takes without reason. And when we try to bend it to our desires, we break. But when we let go, when we flow with the impermanence, something loosens, something softens. We stop trying to control the river, we start learning how to swim, or maybe how to float. That floating is the heart of Schopenhauer's quiet wisdom. Not because it avoids suffering, but because it stops resisting it. And that resistance, he believed, is where most of our agony lives. We don't just feel pain, we feel outraged that we are in pain. We don't just age, we panic at the signs of age. We don't just lose people, we fight the reality of loss as if it were an insult instead of a law. But if we could accept these things, not passively but deeply, then maybe we could begin to live differently. Not with constant striving, but with spaciousness, with room for sorrow, with patience for imperfection, with reverence for the fleeting. This doesn't mean we give up. It means we stop pretending that more is the answer. That progress will save us. That love will complete us. That success will finally quiet the storm. It won't. And it never has. Even those at the top of the ladder feel the wind. Even those with everything still hear the hum of the will. Wanting, wanting, wanting. Always. And so the wisest among us begin to step back. They live smaller, slower, quieter. They learn the art of enough. They find pleasure not in highs but in calm, not in conquest but in kindness, not in noise but in stillness. And they suffer too, but they suffer consciously. They know what it is. They know why it comes. They don't fight it as an enemy. They greet it as part of life, like the rain, like the wind, like the dark. And in doing so, they teach us something sacred, that suffering isn't the end. It's the doorway to self-knowledge, to depth, to clarity, and maybe, just maybe, to peace. There is something oddly liberating in the thought that happiness was never meant to be permanent, that maybe life isn't broken because it isn't always bright. Schopenhauer didn't sugarcoat this. He held it like a blade, slowly turning it in the light. He said what few dare to say, that suffering is not a mistake, not a detour, not a glitch in the system. It is the system. And once we stop fighting that idea, once we allow it to settle into our bones like cold air in winter, we stop being so surprised when life feels heavy. Most people, he said, are like moths circling a flame, drawn to beauty, drawn to light, drawn to the idea that one day they'll arrive at a moment so perfect that the ache inside them will stop, but it never does, because the ache is not circumstantial, it is structural, built into the bones of existence. And that's what makes Schopenhauer so difficult to swallow. He doesn't give us an escape, he gives us a mirror, and in that mirror we see ourselves stripped of stories, just creatures, wanting, fearing, repeating. But there is a gift in that mirror too, a strange, stubborn kind of grace, because once we admit that the world won't save us, we stop waiting for it to. We stop bargaining with fate. We stop demanding that things go our way. And in that surrender, we begin to see life not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be witnessed, slowly, quietly, on its own unyielding terms. This shift doesn't happen quickly. It's not a single moment of insight. It's a slow erosion of illusions, a gradual unlearning of the myths we inherited, that we are here to be happy, that success is proof of worth, that love will rescue us from ourselves, that pain means something's gone wrong. Schopenhauer shatters those myths, not out of cruelty, but out of compassion. Because nothing hurts more than a lie that doesn't deliver, and nothing heals more than the truth once we are brave enough to face it. That truth is often small, bare, unimpressive, but real. A morning without panic, a meal eaten slowly, a conversation where no one tries to win, a breath taken not to rush to the next thing, but to simply be. These things are not glamorous. They won't get applause, but they are sacred in a way most of the world forgets, because they are free of striving, free of performance, free of the will, at least for a moment. And in those moments, something ancient and quiet stirs, a kind of awareness, a soft presence, not joy exactly, but something older, something that knows how to endure, how to sit with pain, how to witness sorrow without becoming it. That is the real strength Schopenhauer points to, not the strength of domination or triumph, but the strength to face the world as it is, without flinching, without numbing, without pretending. And perhaps that's why his philosophy has endured, because it speaks to a part of us that is tired of pretending, tired of smiling through brokenness, tired of performing gratitude while quietly falling apart. It speaks to the part of us that longs to stop, to rest, to say, this is hard and that is okay. This hurts and that is human. This isn't what I wanted, and that is the truth. And when we say those things, really say them, we don't collapse. We soften, we open. We begin to breathe again. Because now at last we are not fighting reality. We are walking with it. And that shift, though small, changes everything. It's what allows us to begin seeing others differently, too. Schopenhauer believed that all ethics begins in compassion. Not in rules, not in religion, but in the quiet recognition that others suffer like we do. That behind every smile is a private ache. That beneath every act of cruelty is often a deeper wound. And that when we see clearly, we hurt less, not just for ourselves, but for others. We stop needing to be right. We stop needing to win. We stop needing to defend our pain by denying someone else's. And in that, we become gentler, not weaker, wiser, more attuned, more real. That is the moral vision Schopenhauer offers. A life not of moral perfection, but of moral humility. A life where we stop adding to the pain, where we stop throwing stones because we realize the house is already fragile. And this awareness doesn't make life easier. It makes it deeper, more nuanced, more sensitive to the strange textures of being alive, the sadness that visits for no reason, the joy that arrives in unexpected stillness, the grief that doesn't ask for permission, the love that hurts more than it heals, all of it, all part of the same wild, aching, mysterious thing. And the more we resist it, the harder it gets. But the more we surrender, not as defeat but as understanding, the more we begin to move with life instead of against it. Like a boat adjusting to the current, like a tree bending in the wind, like a person finally allowing themselves to feel what they feel without shame. That's where the real transformation begins, not with answers, with honesty. And Schopenhauer, for all his darkness, gives us that honesty, again and again. He tells us that life is hard, that suffering is real, that the will is blind and relentless. But he also tells us that art exists, that music can touch the soul without words, that beauty can silence the will, if only briefly, that in those moments we are not slaves to desire, we are simply here, breathing, seeing, being. And maybe that is enough, not always, but sometimes, and sometimes is more than nothing. Sometimes is where the light gets in, through the cracks, through the weariness, through the moments we least expect. And that light, however faint, is what keeps us going. Not because it promises a happy ending, but because it reminds us that even in a world built on longing, stillness is possible, that even in a life of pain, grace is still real, and that maybe, just maybe, the meaning of it all isn't to be found in triumph, but in tenderness, in the way we hold each other, in the way we speak honestly, in the way we suffer without turning to cruelty. That is the hidden hope, the quiet revolution. Not to escape the will, but to see it clearly, and choose, again and again, to be gentle anyway. There's a peculiar kind of wisdom that only suffering can give, not the shallow pain of inconvenience or frustration, but the long ache that lingers beneath the surface of things. The ache of knowing the world will never quite match the image we had of it, that people will leave, bodies will fail, joy will flicker and vanish before we've even held it properly. And in this quiet unravelling, Schopenhauer found not just despair, but clarity, a harsh and tender clarity that stripped life of its false promises and left behind something harder, but more honest, more durable, more true, and that truth, once seen, can never be unseen, because it doesn't come from books or beliefs or philosophies. It comes from within, from that hollow space that grows inside us when life doesn't go according to plan, when the illusion of control slips from our fingers and we're left staring into the dark, wondering what it's all for. And Schopenhauer's answer, if you can call it that, was both brutal and oddly gentle. It's not for anything. There is no grand design, no cosmic reward, no divine justice waiting behind the curtain. There is only the will, the blind, insatiable force that drives all life, the impulse to persist, to continue, to grasp and hunger and strive without end. And yet, even knowing this, there is something deeply human about the refusal to collapse, about standing up each morning, brushing off the dust and walking forward into another uncertain day. Not because we believe it will bring happiness, but because something quieter and more resilient has taken root in us. Something that accepts suffering, not as failure, but as the fabric of being. And this acceptance, this calm, unsentimental recognition of pain, does not make us numb. It makes us more awake, more attuned to the real, to the moments that shimmer in their impermanence, to the flicker of light on a glass of water, to the warmth of a hand that holds ours without needing to fix anything. Just to say, I'm here, you're not alone. And this kind of presence, this deep stillness that arises not from ignorance, but from deep familiarity with sorrow, is what Schopenhauer quietly honoured. not in grand declarations, but in the way he looked at the world and saw it for what it was, not what he wished it to be. And perhaps that's the rarest form of love. To see something clearly, not look away. To see life not as a fairy tale, but as a fragile, flickering candle in a drafty room and still choose to protect the flame. To cradle it gently, even knowing it won't last. And this kind of love, this sober tenderness, is not romantic or idealistic. It is quiet and deliberate, and often goes unnoticed, but it is powerful because it refuses to turn suffering into spectacle. It refuses to pretend that everything is okay when it's not. And in doing so, it gives permission for others to tell the truth too. To say, I'm tired, I'm scared, I don't know how to keep going, and to be met not with fixes or platitudes, but with understanding, with a silence that holds rather than judges. And this is where Schopenhauer, despite his bleakness, becomes strangely hopeful. Because in a world ruled by the will, in a world where pain is the price of existence, compassion becomes the most radical act. Not because it erases suffering, but because it refuses to add to it, refuses to turn away from it, refuses to let it isolate us from each other. And this compassion, rooted not in sentiment but in clarity, is what allows us to endure, to continue, not as heroes or saints, but as people who have learned to live with open eyes and soft hands. People who know that joy and grief are not opposites but twins, that beauty often walks hand in hand with loss, and that the most meaningful things in life are rarely planned or permanent or perfect. They are fleeting and fragile, and all the more sacred because of it. And this sacredness is not found in temples or rituals or declarations. It's found in the way we sit with someone in silence, in the way we forgive quietly without needing to be thanked, in the way we carry our own pain without projecting it onto others. And this way of living, though small and humble and often invisible, is the true resistance against the will, not by fighting it directly, but by choosing, moment by moment, to be aware, to be kind, to be present. And this choice, though it may seem passive, is deeply active, because it requires constant attention, constant returning to the breath, to the moment, to the reality that we are here, alive, hurting, and still capable of love. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is what Schopenhauer meant when he spoke of the beauty that can exist in art, in music, in contemplation. Those rare moments when the will is silent and something else speaks, something that doesn't want or demand or fear, something that simply is. And in those moments, we are not consumers or competitors or sufferers. We are witnesses, we are beings, and in being, we find a strange, wordless peace, the kind that doesn't deny the darkness, but moves gently through it, the kind that doesn't promise answers, but offers presence, and that presence, offered to ourselves and to each other, is perhaps the closest thing we have to redemption, not because it saves us from suffering, but because it honours it, allows it, shares it. And in that shared space, something begins to soften, something begins to heal, not into perfection, but into wholeness. The kind of wholeness that says, I am not fixed, I am not finished, but I am here, and I am trying to live with eyes open and heart steady, even when the world shakes, even when the will howls, even when the path disappears into fog. I am here, and maybe that is the only truth we ever need. There's a strange peace in understanding that not everything needs to be overcome, that some things are simply meant to be carried, like the ache in the chest that never quite leaves, like the memories that return at night, uninvited, quiet and persistent as rain against glass. And Schopenhauer understood this better than most, understood that life wasn't a mountain to be conquered, but a landscape to be witnessed, filled with storms and silence and stretches of aching stillness. And in that witnessing, there is power. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the soft kind that endures without applause, that keeps going even when the map disappears, that learns to sit with what is, not what could have been. And in this sitting, there is a kind of defiance, a refusal to be consumed by the machinery of desire, the endless pulling of the will that whispers more, better, faster now, because Schopenhauer saw how easily we become slaves to this whisper, how even our noblest pursuits can be twisted into tools of the will, how art becomes commerce, how love becomes ownership, how knowledge becomes vanity. And in naming this, he didn't condemn ambition or passion or progress, but he warned us to look underneath them, to ask what they were feeding, what fire they were stoking, because when the will drives everything, nothing is ever enough. Not the success, not the praise, not the perfect house or the perfect body or the perfect partner, because once the goal is reached, the hunger shifts. The eyes look elsewhere. The chase begins again, and we call this life, we call it growth, but Schopenhauer called it what it is, suffering disguised as progress. And yet he did not say we should stop living, stop loving, stop creating. He said we should see clearly so that our actions come from awareness, not compulsion, so that we are not dragged by the will, but occasionally able to step outside of it, to see it for what it is, to watch its games, and choose now and then not to play. And that choice, even made once, even made quietly, is a form of liberation. Not total, not permanent, but real. And it begins with the recognition that control is mostly an illusion, that much of what happens to us is not our fault, not our design, not our punishment or reward. It is the chaotic unfolding of a world that doesn't revolve around our wishes. And that truth is terrifying at first, like standing on the edge of a cliff with no guardrails. But over time, it becomes freeing. Because if we are not to blame for every sorrow, then we don't need to solve every sorrow. We don't need to constantly fix or perform or optimize. We can just be, we can breathe, we can let things be imperfect without taking it personally. And this doesn't mean we become passive. It means we become selective, intentional, deliberate. It means we learn the art of enough, of saying this is good, this is sufficient, this is real. And in that realness there is room to rest, to exhale, to stop performing for an invisible audience. Because Schopenhauer knew that much of our suffering comes not from life itself, but from the expectation that it should be something else, something smoother, happier, more coherent. But it's not. And when we stop expecting it to be, we begin to live in the cracks, in the pauses, in the unspectacular beauty of what actually is. And this kind of living is quiet, often invisible, but it is profoundly brave, because it resists the pressure to chase, to compete, to be remarkable, and instead chooses to be present, to be kind, to be real. And this realism is not cold, it is compassionate, because it sees others not as rivals or props or threats, but as fellow sufferers, fellow wanderers in a landscape that doesn't explain itself. And from that seeing comes empathy, not the sugary kind that feels good to give, but the grounded kind that holds space, that doesn't flinch at pain, that listens without fixing, that stays when things get uncomfortable. And in that staying, in that willingness to be with what hurts, we offer something rare, a refuge, a reminder that maybe we don't need to be rescued, maybe we just need to be seen. And this seeing is what Schopenhauer offered, not through sentiment, but through clarity, through the radical act of naming what most people deny, that life is hard, that joy is fleeting, that meaning is not guaranteed, but that even so, even with all of this, something beautiful persists. Not in the big moments, but in the small ones. The way a child laughs without knowing why, the way trees move in the wind, the way a stranger's kindness lingers longer than expected. These moments do not cancel the suffering, but they coexist with it. And in that coexistence, there is something sacred, not holy in a religious sense, but in the sense of being fully undeniably alive, awake to both the ache and the wonder. And this is the space Schopenhauer invites us into, not a place of answers, but a place of attention, where we stop trying to win at life and start trying to witness it, to hold it gently, to let it break us open and teach us how to feel without being destroyed. And this feeling, this capacity to be touched, is what makes us human. Not our intelligence, not our achievements, but our vulnerability, our sensitivity to beauty and to pain. And Schopenhauer never asked us to stop feeling. He asked us to feel with awareness, to love with our eyes open, to suffer without turning it into spectacle, to live with the kind of humility that knows we don't control much, but we can choose how we meet what comes and how we treat those who walk beside us in the dark. And maybe that's all we can do. Maybe that's enough to walk gently, to speak truthfully, to sit beside pain without running, to find in the ordinary rhythm of existence a kind of quiet redemption. Not flashy, not final, but real. The kind that comes not from changing the world, but from changing how we see it, how we move through it, how we touch it with our presence. There are mornings when the weight is already there before the day begins, when the eyes open and something heavy sits on the chest, something without a name, but full of gravity. And Schopenhauer knew this feeling well, wrote about it not as an anomaly, but as a feature of life, the residue of consciousness itself, the unavoidable ache that comes from knowing too much and controlling too little. And he offered no easy balm for this weight, no motivational mantra, no bright horizon. He simply named it, described it, laid it bare in all its rawness, and in doing so gave it a kind of dignity, made it something to understand rather than escape. And that understanding, though not joyful, is powerful, because once we stop needing the world to be different, we begin to see it more clearly. And clarity, even when it reveals suffering, is a form of light. Not the blinding light of false hope, but the quiet glow that helps us walk without stumbling, that shows us the edges and the shadows and the places we once refused to look. And in those places we find ourselves. Not the version shaped by dreams or fear or performance, but the raw self, the one that exists beneath roles and goals, the one that breathes and aches and endures. And this endurance, Schopenhauer believed, is not weakness but wisdom. Because life isn't a race to be won or a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be lived, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And the way we live it, whether with delusion or awareness, makes all the difference. Because awareness allows for gentleness, and gentleness allows for connection. And connection, however fleeting, is what gives life its texture, its depth, its fragile beauty. And that beauty is not found in grand victories or perfect endings. It's found in the way someone brushes a strand of hair behind their ear, in the way a voice softens when it says, "I understand," in the way the light hits the floor at dusk, small things, forgotten things, things that don't change the world but change us, because they remind us that even in a life governed by the will, by hunger and repetition and loss, moments of stillness and tenderness still rise like mist from the earth. And Schopenhauer saw this not as a contradiction, but as a paradox, that even in a world of suffering, beauty appears, not in spite of the pain, but through it. And the more we accept the suffering, the more we notice the beauty, because we're no longer chasing an ideal. We're witnessing reality, and reality, when stripped of illusion, is both brutal and breathtaking, like standing in a cold wind at the edge of a cliff, alone, trembling, and utterly awake. And in that wakefulness there is room for truth, not the kind that shouts or solves, but the kind that sits with us in silence, that lets us cry without rushing us, that knows the difference between fixing and understanding. And understanding is what Schopenhauer offered, a lens through which the messiness of life becomes less personal and more universal, less about failure and more about form, because the form of life includes suffering the way the sea includes salt. And to live well is not to purify, but to perceive, to hold both the ache and the awe without needing to resolve them. And in this holding, something in us matures, grows quieter, more discerning, less impressed by noise, more drawn to depth. And depth is where the real living happens. Not in the spotlight, but in the shadows. Not in the applause, but in the stillness, after the crowd is gone. And that stillness, though empty at first, becomes a sanctuary, a place where we meet ourselves without pretense, where we learn the language of our own soul. And that language is not always coherent or kind, but it is honest. And honesty is the foundation of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever we want, but the freedom to see clearly, to choose wisely, to suffer consciously. And this conscious suffering is not masochism, it's maturity. It's the realization that avoiding pain often makes it worse, that pretending it's not there only deepens its roots. But facing it, naming it, allowing it, that is how we soften its grip, not by defeating it, but by walking beside it, step by step, moment by moment, until it becomes familiar. And familiarity breeds not contempt, but courage, because what we know we can endure, and what we endure we can understand, and what we understand we can hold, and what we hold we can offer. Not as answers, but as presence. And presence is what the world needs most, not solutions or slogans, but people willing to be here, fully, quietly, without turning away. And Schopenhauer, in his own flawed and fierce way, was present. Present to the absurdity and the agony and the occasional grace of being human. And in that presence, he left behind not a path to happiness, but a path to depth, to authenticity, to the kind of life that doesn't shy away from the dark, but finds light within it. The kind of life that doesn't chase meaning, but creates it in the way it pays attention. The way it stays soft in a hard world. The way it turns pain into wisdom and solitude into peace. And this peace is not constant, not total, but it is enough. Enough to get through the long nights and the quiet mornings. Enough to offer a hand when someone else stumbles. Enough to remind us that we are not alone. And in a world as cold and chaotic as this one, that reminder is everything. Not because it saves us, but because it sustains us. Because it whispers that even here, even now, something sacred remains. Not in the sky or the heavens, but in the way we choose to live, with clarity, with compassion, with the quiet strength to see what is and keep loving anyway. There's a particular kind of silence that follows disillusionment. Not the loud crash of disappointment, but the slow, cold settling of truth, like snow falling in an empty street. And Schopenhauer lived much of his life in that silence, observing the world not with bitterness, though he often sounded bitter, but with a kind of exhausted clarity, as if he'd seen through every mask too many times to still be surprised. And in that seeing he found something most people spend their lives avoiding. He found the still point beneath the chaos, the quiet beneath the clamour, the emptiness beneath the illusions we build around ourselves. And that emptiness, he argued, wasn't a flaw, but a feature. Because when the chase ends, when the wanting softens, when the need to be seen or praised or remembered dissolves, what's left is the bare experience of being, unpolished, unpromised, and often unbearably ordinary. But within that ordinariness lies the seed of peace. A peace not based on achievement or escape, but on the simple act of witnessing life, without flinching, without demanding, without turning it into a transaction. And this kind of witnessing is rare, because the will, as he saw it, doesn't want peace. It wants motion, it wants conflict, it wants goals and dramas and endless movement forward. But forward to what, he would ask, because even the most brilliant success fades, even the greatest love eventually decays or distorts, and even the purest ambition curdles into restlessness once it's fulfilled. So what remains, what endures, what matters when the noise quiets down and we're left alone with ourselves? And the answer, if there is one, isn't found in answers at all, but in presence, in the moment by moment choosing to see things as they are, to touch the world with less demand and more reverence, not because the world deserves it, but because we do. Because we suffer more when we resist, when we insist that life be different, that it give us what it never promised. And so we build stories to protect us. We call pain temporary, call love eternal, call success meaningful. And sometimes those stories help. Sometimes they give us the courage to keep going. But sometimes they imprison us, tie us to expectations that collapse under the weight of reality. And Schopenhauer's gift, if we can call it that, was to burn those stories down, to say, look, this is what's real. We want and we suffer and we chase, and we lose, and in between we glimpse beauty, we touch kindness, we feel the warmth of another being's presence, and that is enough. Not because it satisfies, but because it softens, and softness is a kind of strength we rarely talk about, a strength that doesn't fight but yields, that doesn't conquer but holds, that doesn't demand but listens. And listening is what Schopenhauer did. To himself, to the world, to the strange rhythm of existence, and in that listening he found not salvation but understanding, and understanding, though it doesn't erase pain, makes it more bearable, makes it less isolating, because we start to see that our struggles are not unique, that beneath all the noise people carry the same quiet ache, the same fear of being forgotten, the same longing to be seen, not for what they do, but for who they are when the lights are off and the masks are down. And in that seeing we become gentler, not just with others but with ourselves, because we realise how much energy we've spent performing, pretending, pushing against the current, and slowly we begin to turn inward, not to escape but to return to the place in us that knows how to sit still, how to breathe without urgency, how to love without needing to possess. And this return is not a retreat, it's a revolution, a quiet one, invisible to most but profound, because in a world obsessed with more, choosing less is an act of defiance, choosing enough is an act of wisdom, choosing to witness instead of win is an act of courage. And Schopenhauer in his solitude modelled this courage, not perfectly, not kindly, but honestly, and honesty, especially the kind that doesn't flatter or console, is one of the rarest forms of love, because it gives without trying to please, it shares without needing to be understood, it exists for its own sake, and that kind of existence is what Schopenhauer ultimately pointed toward. Not a life free of suffering, but a life rich in awareness, grounded in presence, softened by compassion. And though he didn't often speak of love in glowing terms, his entire philosophy was a call to love more wisely, more patiently, more quietly, to love not by fixing or saving or possessing, but by being, by enduring, by staying. And in staying we begin to understand that suffering is not the enemy, illusion is, and when the illusions fall away, when the world stops pretending to be fair or kind or ordered, we are left with what was always true, that we are fragile, and so is everyone else. And maybe that's not a reason to despair, but a reason to hold each other closer, to walk slower, to speak more gently, to let go of the need to be remarkable, and instead become real, become someone who can sit in silence with another person and not fill it with noise, who can hear pain without rushing to fix it, who can see the beauty in a moment that will never come again, and never needed to, because it was enough just once, just for a second, and that second, fully lived, fully felt, is worth more than a lifetime spent chasing what was never real to begin with. There is a soft violence in expectation, a slow erosion of peace that begins the moment we decide life owes us something, a sense of fairness, a return for our effort, a happy ending. And Schopenhauer, unlike the many philosophers who tried to make life behave through reason or optimism or structured ideals, stripped it bare of that pretense. He looked it in the face and said it clearly. Life is not fair. The world is not just. The will does not care who suffers, and trying to negotiate with it as if it were a conscious force leads only to bitterness. Because what we are up against is not malice, but indifference, a blind striving that lives in everything, from the roots of trees twisting toward water, to the endless wars waged for land and power, to the child crying for attention before it knows the word for love. And this will, this unconscious engine of desire, does not stop. It does not reflect. It does not learn. And in realizing this, Schopenhauer found something strange. He found permission to stop resisting it, not to give in to it, but to recognize that its hold over us weakens when we see it for what it is, because so much of our suffering comes not from pain itself, but from the belief that pain is a punishment, that if we were better, kinder, smarter, more spiritual, we would not feel this way, but that is the cruelest delusion, the one that says we are to blame for the weather of our souls, and Schopenhauer, harsh though he was, offered a way out of that trap, a way to see suffering not as failure, but as condition, as the natural price of existence. And when we see it like that, we stop performing wellness. We stop pretending everything is okay when it's not. And in that honesty, there is relief, because it takes so much energy to pretend, to smile while breaking, to strive while empty. And the truth is that most people are tired, not just physically, but existentially. Tired of pretending that the answers are working, that the dream is delivering. Tired of running toward goals that shift the moment they are touched. And Schopenhauer understood that this exhaustion isn't a weakness. It's a sign of awakening, a sign that the soul is starting to ask a different question. Not how do I get more, but what can I live without? Not how do I fix this, but how do I sit with it? Not how do I win, but how do I stay human in a world that demands so much forgetting? And this forgetting is everywhere. It is built into the structure of society, into the endless scroll and the empty praise and the way success is measured by noise instead of depth. But Schopenhauer refused to forget. He held the pain in his gaze and asked us to do the same. Not because it would save us, but because it would make us real. And in being real, we find something better than comfort. We find meaning, not the grand kind that explains everything, but the small kind that makes a single moment bearable, a single act of kindness sacred, a single breath deep enough to carry us through the next hour. And this kind of meaning is not advertised, it is not sold or taught in bright rooms. It is grown in silence, in solitude, in the soft places where we are allowed to grieve without being told to be grateful. And it is here, in this quiet soil, that Schopenhauer's hidden hope takes root. Not hope as expectation, but hope as endurance. Hope as the refusal to become cruel even when the world is. Hope as the quiet knowing that while suffering is inevitable, despair is not. Because despair requires illusion, requires the belief that something should be different. And once we let go of should, we are free to live what is, to shape it gently with our choices, to find beauty not as escape but as witness. And this witnessing is powerful. It is what art does, what music does, what deep friendship does. And it is also what we do for ourselves when we stop judging our pain and start tending to it, like a wound that doesn't need to be explained, just cleaned and held and given time. And maybe this is the real task, not to perfect ourselves or transcend suffering, but to accompany it, to learn its language, to hear what it teaches us about tenderness and humility and the deep longing that lives beneath every complaint, the longing to be seen, to be held, to be known not for our performance but for our presence. And this presence is what survives when the illusions fall away, when the roles dissolve, when the striving quiets. And Schopenhauer, for all his grimness, pointed toward that presence, not through joy but through negation, through the stripping away of what was never ours to keep. And what remains, when all else falls, is strangely gentle, not sweet, not easy, but spacious. Like the air after a storm, like the silence after grief, has said all it needed to say. And in this space we begin to sense the outlines of a different kind of life, one not based on accumulation, but on attunement, one that does not seek to dominate the world, but to dwell in it, quietly, with care. And this care, though it may seem small, is sacred, because it resists the will not with violence, but with attention, with the slow, deliberate choosing to stay soft in a world that rewards hardness, to stay honest in a world that runs on spin, to stay awake in a world that would rather sleep. And in these choices, repeated gently and without drama, we begin to create a life reflects not the chaos of the will, but the clarity of the one who has seen it, named it, and chosen even so to love. There's a quiet strength in those who no longer seek to be understood, not because they've given up on connection, but because they've stopped trying to explain away their pain, stopped trying to make it palatable, or productive, or poetic. And this, more than almost anything, is what Schopenhauer invites us into, a life where suffering doesn't need to be justified to be real, where it doesn't need to be turned into wisdom or repackaged into something inspiring, where it is simply allowed to be, as valid and undeniable as the air we breathe. And in allowing that, we begin to see just how much of modern life is built on the avoidance of this truth, how we fill our days with noise and our minds with goals, and our hearts with hope, not because we are truly driven, but because we are afraid that if we were to stop, to truly stop, we would feel the weight that has been waiting there all along. And Schopenhauer was not afraid to feel it, not afraid to say out loud that existence is not a gift we asked for, that we are born into a world that grinds and forgets and consumes, and yet somehow we are expected to smile, to compete, to be grateful, to act as if the suffering is optional, and his refusal to play that game is not cruelty, it is clarity, the kind of clarity that burns at first because it strips away comfort, but that later begins to heal, not with promises, but with truth. And this truth is not hopeless, it is grounding, because once we stop expecting the world to be fair, we can begin to be kind. Once we stop demanding that life be happy, we can begin to be present. Once we stop trying to win the game, we can start asking better questions. Not how do I succeed, but how do I endure? Not how do I fix this pain, but how do I hold it? Not how do I escape, but how do I live more fully within the limits of what is real? And these questions do not lead to answers. They lead to presence, the kind of presence that sees a friend's sorrow and doesn't try to fix it, that hears a cry and doesn't rush to silence it, that feels the trembling in the chest and doesn't label it weakness, because in a world that equates value with visibility and worth with utility, to feel deeply is itself an act of rebellion. And Schopenhauer, though solitary and often scorned, lived that rebellion daily, walking the streets alone, refusing the academic games of his peers, choosing instead to speak plainly, even when it cost him. And this plainness is what gives his philosophy its power, not its complexity, but its honesty, the way it puts words to what so many feel but never say, the way it strips life of its distractions and demands that we see it not as we wish it were, but as it is, unpredictable, unsatisfying, and yet still filled with strange, haunting moments of beauty. The kind of beauty that doesn't rescue us but reminds us, that doesn't promise peace but offers a pause, and in that pause we catch our breath. We feel the weight without collapsing. We begin to understand that maybe life was never meant to be a story with a rising arc and a triumphant ending. Maybe it is more like a song, with dissonance and silence and repetition, with no destination but many moods, and maybe our role is not to write the song, but to listen, to notice its rhythm, to hear the places where it breaks and rebuilds. And Schopenhauer heard that music, not always with joy, but with reverence. And in hearing it, he invited others to listen too, to stop trying to make sense of everything, and instead learn to feel their way through. And feeling, real feeling, is something the modern world resists at every turn, with its quick fixes and curated lives and endless distractions. But beneath all of it, beneath the striving and posturing and branding, there is still the ancient question, the one we ask when the lights are off and the noise has settled. What is all this for? And Schopenhauer didn't answer that question with a map, but with a mirror that shows us our hunger, our fear, our fragility, but also our capacity for depth, for presence, for quiet strength. And that quiet strength is what endures, what holds us when the illusions fall away, what allows us to sit in the dark and still recognize the shape of something sacred, not in spite of the suffering, but within it, like a pearl formed in irritation, like a truth shaped by time. And this kind of sacredness doesn't come with halos or hymns. It comes with breath, with attention, with the willingness to stay. And staying is what Schopenhauer did. Not because he believed things would get better, but because he believed they mattered even if they didn't. And this belief, subtle and unwavering, is what keeps his work alive. Not its pessimism, but its integrity. the way it honours the rawness of existence, without trying to smooth it over, the way it respects the listener enough to tell the hard truth. And in a world of distractions, that kind of truth is a rare and radical gift. One that doesn't shout but whispers, that doesn't lead but walks beside us, and that walking, that shared presence, is maybe all we need. Not to be saved, but to be seen. Not to be lifted out of suffering, but to be held within it. Not to be told what to believe, but to be reminded that even in the ache, there is something worth attending to, something honest, something ancient, something quietly alive. There is something deeply human about returning to the same questions, even when we know they have no answers, about circling around the same ache in different forms, different faces, different decades, because somewhere in that repetition, we start to understand not the solution, but the shape of what it means to live. And Schopenhauer, who saw repetition as the structure of all existence, as the engine of the will itself, also knew that this cycle was both our curse and our canvas, that while the will repeats blindly, birth, desire, disappointment, death, our awareness of that repetition is what makes us conscious, what gives us the possibility not to escape it but to reflect on it, to soften inside it, to learn, slowly, how to suffer without cruelty and to love without illusion. And maybe this is the subtle hope hidden in his so-called pessimism, that we are not machines doomed to loop endlessly, but beings capable of seeing the loop, of feeling the rhythm and choosing to move differently within it. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or declarations, but quietly, with gentler hands, with fewer expectations, with more reverence for the strange and difficult gift of simply being here. And here, for Schopenhauer, meant not just the physical world, but the inner world, the theatre of thoughts and fears and moods that make up our lived experience far more than the events themselves. Because pain, he said, is not in the thing, but in the wanting, in the gap between what is and what we wish. And while that gap can never be fully closed, we can learn to stop making it wider. We can learn to want less violently, to desire with more humility, to approach life not as a prize to be claimed, but as a presence to be noticed, and that noticing is everything, because so often the moments that change us are not the ones we planned, not the milestones we chased, but the fleeting instants we didn't expect. The way someone's voice trembles when they say "I'm scared," the way sunlight pools on the floor in the late afternoon, the quiet thrill of recognizing yourself in a stranger's sadness. And these moments, though they pass, leave a mark, not because they gave us something, but because they allowed us to feel more fully what was already there. And this kind of feeling is not soft or sentimental. It is sharp and grounding, the kind of feeling that does not distract but deepens. And Schopenhauer, more than most, believed that depth is the only real antidote to despair. Not distraction, not denial, not the pursuit of shallow happiness, but depth, the willingness to descend into the complexity of what it means to be alive, to stay in the room with your own suffering until it begins to teach you something quieter than words. And this teaching is not academic. It is lived. It is learned in the body, in the breath, in the long silence after something important is lost. And while Schopenhauer didn't believe in meaning with a capital M, he did believe in beauty, in art, in music, in anything that allowed the will to pause even briefly, anything that created a space where we are not just driven creatures, but witnesses. And in that witnessing, he found not salvation, but sanctuary, a temporary reprieve, a softening, a place where for a moment we are not wanting, not chasing, not fearing, but simply being. And these moments, though fleeting, are not trivial. They are sacred because they remind us that we are not just the sum of our needs, that there is something in us that can see the world and not need to possess it, that can hear a piece of music and not want it to last forever, that can love a person without needing to own them. And this kind of love, this spacious, non-attached, open-hearted presence, is what Schopenhauer glimpsed in his quietest hours. And perhaps that's what makes his work endure, not because it solves our pain, but because it meets us there, unflinchingly, without shame, and says, yes, this is real, and you're not weak for feeling it. And this permission, this soft allowance of what is the first step toward a life that does not deny suffering, but does not collapse under it either. A life that can sit at the table with grief and still light a candle, still pour tea, still offer a hand across the darkness. Not to rescue, but to accompany. And in that accompanying, something shifts, something heals. Not completely, not forever, but enough to keep going. Enough to remember that we are not alone in the dark. That others too have walked this path, have questioned everything, have hurt deeply and still chosen to stay. And this choice, quiet and uncelebrated, is the heart of what it means to live consciously, to suffer wisely, to walk softly through a world that does not explain itself. And maybe that's all Schopenhauer wanted. 2. Strip away the noise until only that remained. The candle, the silence, the breath, the awareness, and the soft, steady presence of a mind that has stopped asking the world to change and started learning how to see it, how to sit with it, how to love it, gently, without demand. There is a strange kind of peace that comes not from solving the puzzle of life, but from putting down the pieces and deciding to sit beside them, to stop forcing a picture that never quite fit. And this is the peace Schopenhauer arrived at, not through triumph, not through joy, but through surrender, through the quiet letting go of the illusion that things should be otherwise. And in that letting go, he found something more enduring than happiness, something slower and more resilient, equanimity, the kind that doesn't sparkle but sustains, the kind that allows for sorrow without panic, the longing without collapse, the life without performance. And if there is one truth that threads through all his work, it is this: that the world is not designed for our comfort or our comprehension, that nature is indifferent, that desire is endless, that even love is bound by time and need and loss. And yet in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, we can live fully. Not by overcoming suffering, but by dwelling in it consciously, by shaping a life not around escape, but around engagement, around the small steady acts that make existence bearable, even beautiful. And these acts are rarely grand. They are often invisible, like the decision to forgive without being asked, the choice to listen without interrupting, the soft refusal to lie even when the truth complicates things. And Schopenhauer, though often branded as cold or bitter, was in many ways deeply ethical, because his philosophy did not begin with how we should act, but with how we suffer. And from that understanding came compassion, not the sentimental kind that tries to fix others, but the grounded kind that simply stays, that bears witness, that recognizes the pain of being alive and says, I see it too. And this seeing is the foundation of kindness, because when we understand that everyone is hurting in ways they don't show, we stop expecting so much. We start appreciating more. We become slower to judge and quicker to comfort. And in this slowing down, we begin to live differently. Not with the manic urgency of the will, but with the steady awareness of one who has accepted the terms of the contract and chosen to sign anyway, knowing full well that the story ends the same for everyone, but also knowing that how we spend the pages matters, that the tone of our presence, the quality of our attention, the softness of our gaze can transform even the most ordinary moments into something meaningful. Not in the eyes of history, but in the quiet corners of the soul. And it is in these corners that Schopenhauer's legacy lives. Not in systems or revolutions or schools of thought, but in the minds of those who have sat alone with themselves and found in his words a mirror, a companion, a strangely comforting echo of their own darkest thoughts. And perhaps that is his greatest gift. Not optimism, not resolution, but solidarity. The reminder that being broken is not a personal failure, but a universal fact. That to ache is not to malfunction, but to be human. And once we stop resisting that, once we stop pretending that the goal of life is to be okay all the time, we begin to see new possibilities, not for escape, but for expression, not for avoidance, but for authenticity. And authenticity is not easy. It is not rewarded. It is often misunderstood and sometimes punished. But it is the only thing that lets us breathe fully, that lets us look in the mirror without flinching, that lets us say, "This is who I am." Not perfect, not healed, not finished, but real. And in that realness we find others. Not the polished versions they show the world, but the raw ones, the scared ones, the honest ones who are also trying to make sense of it all. And with them we build something that doesn't need to be explained. Something that doesn't ask for certainty or solutions, just presence, just patience, just the willingness to walk beside each other through the fog. And maybe that is the only kind of meaning we ever get. Not the kind that comes from knowing, but the kind that comes from being known. Not the kind that comes from achieving, but the kind that comes from enduring together. And Schopenhauer endured, alone much of the time, misunderstood often, but he endured with eyes open, with a heart that refused to look away. And in that refusal he left us not a path but a posture, not a doctrine but a stance, a way of facing the world without illusions, of loving without possession, of living without noise. And though his words can feel heavy, they are also grounding, because they remind us that we are not crazy for feeling that life is hard. We are not broken for struggling to find joy. We are not failing for needing silence, for needing solitude, for needing something real in a world that rewards the fake. And this validation, quiet and unassuming, is a kind of grace, the grace of being understood without needing to perform, the grace of finding in philosophy not answers but companionship, not escape but insight. And insight, when it is deep enough, doesn't solve our pain. It deepens our capacity to carry it with dignity, with awareness, with a kind of sacred weariness that doesn't ask to be saved, but simply asks to be seen. And now, as this story comes to a close, as the candle burns low and the room grows still, we are left with the image of a man who dared to tell the truth, not because it was popular or profitable or pretty, but because it was his, and in telling it, he gave the rest of us permission to tell ours, to feel what we feel, to suffer what we must, and to find, within the silence that follows, a kind of music, not loud, not bright, but persistent and real and strangely beautiful. There comes a point when the mind, worn thin by years of seeking, begins to wonder not what else can be added to life, but what can be subtracted, what weights can be put down without apology, what desires can be released without regret. And this is not a giving up, but a growing quiet, a shift in the centre of gravity, from striving to seeing, from noise to nuance. And Schopenhauer, who spent his life in that deeper current, saw what many still resist, that most of what we chase is shaped not by freedom, but by compulsion, that our goals are not always chosen, but inherited, conditioned, absorbed like background radiation from a culture that worships motion and despises stillness. And so we run, faster and farther, hoping that speed will make up for lack of direction. But underneath it all, there is a simple question pulsing quietly. What if nothing is missing? What if the ache is not a signal to acquire, but to awaken? Not a hunger for more, but a signal to look more deeply into what already is. And Schopenhauer, grim-faced and wide-eyed, insisted on this looking, insisted that we see the machinery of the will for what it is, a blind, tireless urge to become, to want, to pursue endlessly without ever arriving. And the tragedy is not that we want, but that we believe. The next achievement, the next love, the next status will end the wanting, when in truth it only sharpens it. And so the wisest act may not be to chase harder, but to stop, to listen, to pay attention to the quiet parts of life that do not shout for our attention, but offer themselves freely when we finally look. And these moments are rarely glamorous. They do not make headlines or generate applause, but they are real in a way that most things are not. Real like the feeling of water sliding over fingers, like the breath that returns after a sob, like the flicker of recognition in another's eyes when words finally fall away. And in these small silences, we begin to sense another rhythm beneath the one we've been taught. A rhythm not driven by will, but by presence. And presence cannot be bought or earned, it can only be allowed. And this allowing is perhaps the hardest thing in a world that runs on resistance, that teaches us to shape everything, to fix, to optimize, to achieve, but not to witness. Not to simply sit with what is, and yet this sitting is where the alchemy happens. Not because the pain vanishes, but because it reveals its layers, its lessons, its quiet truths. And one of those truths is that suffering is not personal. It is not a punishment. It is the shared language of all who feel, and the moment we stop treating it as a private failure and begin to see it as a universal condition, we begin to soften, to connect, to carry each other not as burdens but as mirrors, as fellow travellers whose brokenness is not a flaw but a feature, a sign that we are alive, awake, paying attention. And Schopenhauer paid attention to everything, to the boredom that follows pleasure, to the cruelty hidden in beauty, to the strange tenderness of solitude when it's chosen rather than imposed. And his gaze, though sharp, was never cruel. It was honest, and honesty, when it reaches deep enough, becomes compassion, because it sees through the surface into the structure, into the roots of why we act the way we do, why we lash out or shut down, or chase things that poison us. And he understood that these are not signs of evil, but of confusion, of misdirected hope, of wanting something stable in a world that never stays still. And so, rather than preach salvation, he offered understanding. An understanding quiet and unspectacular is what holds us together when nothing else can, because it allows us to stay present with what hurts without needing to change it, to touch the edge of suffering without flinching, to say, yes, this too is part of being human, and in that yes, there is power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to endure, to remain open in the face of the closing in, to remain kind in the face of what is harsh. And this kindness, born not of naivety but of deep seeing, is the beginning of a different way to live. Not one that denies the will, but one that walks beside it, aware of its pull, aware of its traps, and choosing, moment by moment, to step more lightly, to expect less, to feel more. And in this feeling there is a strange aching beauty, not because the pain is gone, but because we are no longer fighting it alone, because we have allowed ourselves to belong to the world not as conquerors, but as participants. And participation, full-bodied and heart-first, is the only thing that can redeem suffering. Not by explaining it away, but by letting it shape us, sharpen us, strip us of what is false until only what is true remains. And what is true is often simple and hard. That we want love and fear rejection, that we want meaning and find chaos, that we want peace and discover longing, and yet we keep going, not because we are sure, but because we are moved. Not by logic, but by something deeper, something quieter, and Schopenhauer called it will. But perhaps it is also something else, the part of us that sings when no one is listening, that forgives when there is no apology, that stays soft even after breaking. And if there is any hope to be found in his work, it is here, in this soft refusal to turn away, in this steady gaze that sees the worst and still finds space for beauty, for tenderness, for the slow miracle of being alive even when it hurts. There is a kind of courage that does not shout or shine, a courage that does not look like victory or sound like triumph, but instead resembles quiet survival, the steady return to oneself after disappointment, after loss, after the world shows once again that it cannot be tamed. And Schopenhauer, who was so often painted as bleak, understood this kind of courage better than most. Not the bravery of action, but the bravery of endurance, of stillness, of staying present when it would be easier to retreat into distraction or bitterness or noise. And he saw clearly that much of what we call life is made up of avoiding this stillness, of filling the silence with plans and pleasures and projections, not because we are weak, but because we are afraid that if we were to truly listen to ourselves, to the world, to the hollow spaces between our wants. We might hear something we do not know how to bear, and yet he invites us to do exactly this, to bear it, to meet the ache without interpretation, without narrative, to let it speak not in the language of logic, but in the wordless presence of truth. And this truth, however unwelcome, is necessary, because it frees us from the fantasy that suffering is always a mistake, always an obstacle, when in fact it is often the beginning of vision, of honesty, of depth. And so he does not offer a ladder out of suffering, but a chair beside it, a place to sit and observe and breathe. And in that stillness, something remarkable happens. Not a solution, but a shift. Not a cure, but a clarity. And we begin to see the patterns that once enslaved us. We begin to notice how often we mistake wanting for meaning, how often we trade presence for pursuit, how often we ask life to give us something it never promised. And slowly, we start to release those demands. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but in the small choices that define a life. And this is where Schopenhauer becomes more than a philosopher. He becomes a guide, not toward happiness, but toward integrity, the kind that emerges when we stop pretending. When we stop pretending that everything is fine, that we are unbreakable, that we are not exhausted. And when we admit these truths, gently to ourselves, we begin to make space for healing, for honesty, for the possibility of being known not for our masks but for our essence. And essence is what he cared about. Not appearances or achievements, but the deep structure of what makes us human. And he knew, as few do, that beneath all the layers, what we long for most is not pleasure or power, but peace. The kind of peace that does not erase pain but holds it. The kind that does not arrive with answers, but with acceptance. And acceptance, true acceptance, is an act of love, not passive but powerful, because it means we have stopped trying to manipulate reality into comfort, and have instead chosen to witness it as it is. And witnessing, bare and unadorned, is the beginning of wisdom. Not because it leads to control, but because it leads to understanding. And understanding, quiet and deep, is what allows us to live without becoming cruel, to hurt without becoming hardened, to lose without becoming less. And this is the life Schopenhauer points to. Not the life of achievement, but the life of attention. The life that notices the rain against the window, the wrinkle in a loved one's smile, the sudden hush in a crowded room, the way grief makes everything taste different, the way joy slips in when least expected. And these are not the moments the world will celebrate, but they are the ones that sustain us. And to live for them, to attune to them, is to resist the will, not with force but with finesse, to move through the world without being consumed by it, to carry the weight without letting it deform us. And in this way, his philosophy becomes not a retreat from life, but a deeper immersion in it, an invitation to participate not more frantically, but more faithfully, to show up not because we are guaranteed reward, but because we are committed to truth. And truth, when it is stripped of illusion, becomes a kind of grace, not the grace of answers, but the grace of presence. The grace of being able to sit with what is unbearable and not flinch, and this capacity is not natural. It is cultivated in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the tenderness we offer even when it is not returned, in the way we keep returning to our own breath, our own brokenness, our own hope, not because we expect to be fixed, but because we know that this returning is itself a form of love. And love, in its rawest form, is not about changing others or ourselves, but about being with them, being with what hurts, with what's beautiful, with what's fleeting. And this being with is the hardest and most human thing we can do, and Schopenhauer, for all his sharpness, knew this. He knew that to live fully is not to conquer suffering, but to walk with it, to let it open us, to let it soften us, to let it teach us not how to escape but how to remain. And in remaining, in resisting the urge to run, we find a strength that is not forged in ambition, but in surrender, not in victory, but in vulnerability. And this strength, quiet and enduring, is what carries us through the long nights, through the silent questions, through the parts of life that do not resolve. And so we keep going, not because we know the way, but because we are learning to trust the walk itself, the rhythm of steps taken in the dark, the weight of presence carried with intention. And in this walk we discover that though the will may never rest, we can. Though the world may never offer peace, we can become it in how we speak, in how we hold space, in how we choose again and again to return to what is real. There is an ache that settles into the soul, not from any single wound, but from the accumulation of small disillusionments, from the thousand quiet ways the world fails to meet the myths we are given. And over time, that ache becomes a lens, a filter through which we begin to see the truth more clearly, not as something cruel, but as something unvarnished. And Schopenhauer, ever the surgeon of illusion, understood that the most dangerous lies are not the loud ones, but the subtle ones, the ones dressed as comfort, as common sense, as culture. And perhaps the most insidious of these is the idea that suffering is a deviation, that pain is a problem to be solved rather than a companion to be understood. But when we start from this false premise, every shadow becomes a failure, every grief becomes a flaw. And so we chase light, we chase numbness, we chase the mirage of lasting contentment. And Schopenhauer stands at the edge of that chase and simply says, look again, look at what actually is, not what you want it to be. And in that invitation, there is something radically freeing, because to accept that life is not designed for our pleasure is to begin to relate to it differently. Not as a battlefield, or a marketplace, or a test, but as a phenomenon, a strange, ceaseless unfolding that is neither for us nor against us. And when we stop taking its indifference personally, we can start to participate in it with more grace, with less fear. And this is not resignation, it is recalibration. It is a turning inward toward the only thing we ever truly control: our attention, our choices, our presence. And Schopenhauer knew that presence is not a luxury, but a necessity, because without it, we are ghosts in our own lives, reacting instead of responding, chasing instead of seeing. And what we miss in that blindness is not just beauty, but connection, the subtle weave of meaning that only becomes visible when we slow down. And slowing down is an act of resistance in a world that demands acceleration, that tells us our worth is measured by output, by visibility, by speed. But the truth is, depth takes time, intimacy takes stillness, understanding takes quiet, and most of us are starved for these things. Not because we lack opportunity, but because we are terrified of what we might feel if we stopped distracting ourselves. And Schopenhauer, who lived much of his life alone, learned to face that terror, not to overcome it, but to befriend it, to see in it not a monster, but a mirror. And in that mirror we find the parts of ourselves we've exiled, the grief we never named, the longing we never admitted, the tenderness we buried beneath achievement. And to bring those parts home is not an intellectual exercise, but a practice, a daily choice to live honestly even when it hurts, to speak gently even when we are afraid, to sit in silence even when it trembles with things we do not want to feel. And this is the heart of his wisdom, that we cannot escape suffering, but we can choose how to relate to it, how to move with it, how to allow it to deepen us instead of harden us. And this choice, quiet and continuous, changes everything. Not the facts of our life, but the way they land in us, the way they shape us. And over time, we become different. Not because we have conquered life, but because we have surrendered to its texture. And in that surrender, we become more porous, more responsive, more alive. And to be truly alive is not to be constantly happy. It is to be constantly present. And presence for Schopenhauer was sacred, because it is the only space in which the will loses its grip, the only space where we can glimpse what it means to be free. Not free from pain, but free from compulsion, from illusion, from the endless loops that steal our time and fill us with the vague anxiety that we are somehow behind, somehow missing out, somehow failing. But the truth is, most people are not living. They are running simulations, chasing templates, reacting to expectations that were never theirs. And to wake up from that is not comfortable, but it is clarifying. It is like stepping outside after being indoors too long, squinting into the raw light and realizing that while the world is not safe, it is real. And reality, even in its harshness, is preferable to a beautiful lie. And this is why Schopenhauer's work endures. Not because it makes us feel good, but because it makes us feel true. Because it strips away the sentimental and leaves us with the essential. And the essential is always simple and always hard. To live with awareness, to love without illusion, to suffer with dignity, and to die without regret. And these are not abstract ideals. They are daily choices, and most of them happen in the dark, unseen, uncelebrated. But they matter. They accumulate. They shape who we become, and who we become over time is not a product, but a presence, not a brand, but a being. And in that being there is peace, not the peace of perfection, but the peace of participation, of having shown up, of having cared, of having dared to look at life without flinching. And in the end, maybe that is enough. Maybe that is everything. There is a moment in every thinking person's life when the world begins to lose its sheen, when the stories that once comforted begin to sound hollow, when the paths laid out begin to feel like cages. And for Schopenhauer, this moment was not a crisis, but a beginning, the beginning of a different kind of vision. Not mystical or euphoric, but sober, lucid, unsparing in its clarity, and yet strangely compassionate. Because once we see the machinery behind the curtain, we no longer blame ourselves for being caught in it. We no longer waste our lives trying to win a game whose rules were written by something blind and hungry and indifferent. And this shift is subtle but seismic, because it changes how we relate to failure, to longing, to others, and most importantly, to ourselves. And perhaps that is the most radical aspect of his philosophy. Not its bleakness, but its tenderness. The way it offers a space for the disillusioned to breathe, for the weary to rest. Not with platitudes or promises, but with permission. Permission to feel what we feel without trying to justify it. To struggle without turning it into a lesson. To exist without having to prove our worth. And in a world obsessed with productivity, with branding pain into triumph, this is a kind of heresy. The idea that value is not earned but inherent. That meaning is not created through achievement but discovered through attention. And attention, as Schopenhauer knew, is the rarest and most powerful form of love. Not the love that wants or owns or fixes, but the love that sees, that stays, that does not turn away when things become difficult or dull or strange. And this love is what he extended to the human condition itself. Not by glorifying it, but by acknowledging its complexity, its contradictions, its quiet tragedies. And in doing so, he gave us a language for things we had only felt in silence, the restlessness that lingers even in success, the sorrow that arrives without cause, the odd ache of beauty that cannot be held. And it is through this language that we begin to reclaim parts of ourselves we were told to hide. The grief that outstayed its welcome, the anger that never found a voice, the longing that makes no sense on paper but never leaves. And when we stop pathologizing these parts, when we start welcoming them, we begin to move differently. Not because the world changes, but because we do. We stop chasing highs and start cultivating steadiness. We stop demanding happiness and start honoring presence. We stop looking for rescue and start building resilience. And resilience, in this sense, is not toughness but tenderness practiced over time. The willingness to remain soft in a world that rewards hardness, the courage to stay kind when bitterness would be easier, the quiet decision to keep noticing what is beautiful even when it breaks us. And this noticing is not a passive act. It is a discipline, a way of being that requires us to unlearn almost everything we've been taught about success, about self-worth, about what it means to live well. And Schopenhauer, by refusing to flatter us, helps us see where we've been deceived, helps us peel back the layers of social performance until we arrive at something bare and real and irreducible. And in that space, we meet not just ourselves, but others more fully. Because when we stop performing, others feel safer doing the same, and suddenly conversations become deeper, silences become richer, relationships become less about exchange and more about presence. And in this presence, we begin to taste a different flavour of existence, one that is not driven by what we lack but shaped by what we notice. And what we notice when we are truly awake is often small and strange and beautiful in ways we'd forgotten to see. The way shadows gather in corners at dusk, the way a single note can hold a lifetime of emotion, the way a stranger's tired smile can undo something tight in our chest. And none of these things solve the big questions, but they soften them. They make them livable. They remind us that while we may never find ultimate answers, we can still find meaning in the way we hold the questions, in the way we live them, in the way we keep showing up to this strange, painful, luminous world without needing it to be different in order to be sacred. And that is what Schopenhauer offers. Not a blueprint for happiness, but a lens through which to see more honestly, a mirror in which to recognize the parts of ourselves we were told to discard, a philosophy not of escape but of intimacy, intimacy with life, as it is with ourselves as we are, and in a culture that sells us endless ways to distract, to numb, to improve. This is an invitation, both unsettling and liberating, because it asks us not to transcend suffering, but to inhabit it fully, not to deny the darkness, but to walk through it with our eyes open. And in doing so, we become more whole, not because we are fixed, but because we are integrated, because we no longer split off the parts of ourselves that don't fit the story. And integration, slow and imperfect, is the work of a lifetime. And it is work worth doing, not for reward, but for truth, not for applause, but for peace. And peace, in this sense, is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of awareness, the kind that sits quietly beside the chaos and says, even this, even now, even here. There is something quietly radical about choosing to stay awake in a world built on sleep, to resist the lullaby of distraction, of convenience, of surface comfort, and instead sit fully in the discomfort of being conscious. And this is where Schopenhauer, the soft-spoken heretic of modern hope, took his seat. In the stillness most flee, in the questions most abandon, and from that silence he built a mirror, a dark one, not to frighten but to reflect. And what it shows is not a world of monsters, but a world of longing, of loops, of quiet hunger, repeating itself through generations and gestures and goals. And what he saw with eyes stripped of illusion was that behind every pursuit is a reaching, and behind every reaching is a restlessness. And that restlessness is not a flaw of the individual, but a feature of life itself. Because life, as he defined it, is the visible surface of an invisible will, blind, endless, and self-repeating. And if this sounds dismal, it is only because we are conditioned to equate truth with comfort, meaning with victory, purpose with progress. But Schopenhauer asked a different question. Not how do we win, but how do we live knowing we cannot win? How do we carry ourselves through a world that offers no final satisfaction, no lasting peace, and still choose to act, to love, to notice the shimmer of light on broken glass? And the answer he gave was not a formula, but a posture, not a strategy, but a stance, a way of being that does not fight the futility, but softens within it, that does not try to fix the ache, but listens to it, lets it speak, and in that speaking finds not despair, but solidarity. The quiet truth that all of us are hurting, all of us are lost in our own ways, and when we stop pretending otherwise, something tender begins to unfold. Not because pain disappears, but because it is no longer private, no longer a secret shame carried alone. And this sharedness, this mutual vulnerability, is the beginning of compassion. Not the shallow kind that pities, but the deep kind that sees, that sits beside, that asks nothing but presence. And Schopenhauer's presence, for all its severity, was just that, a mind willing to stay, to witness, to reflect back the darkness without blinking. And that steadiness, that refusal to look away, is a form of love rarely named, because it does not soothe or entertain, but it steadies, it clarifies, it frees. And freedom in this context is not the freedom to do or have or become, but the freedom to see clearly, to choose consciously, to say yes or no. Not from reflex or fear, but from awareness. And that awareness, once cultivated, becomes a kind of light. Not a spotlight that reveals answers, but a candle that makes it possible to see the next step. And sometimes that is enough. One step, one breath, one moment of stillness in which the wheel of wanting pauses, however briefly. And in that pause we remember who we are. Beneath the layers, beneath the performance, beneath the roles and plans and identities that have calcified around our fear of being nothing. And this is the paradox Schopenhauer pointed to again and again, that it is only in surrendering the craving for more that we find what matters, only in turning away from the chase that we arrive. And arrival, in this sense, is not dramatic, it is quiet. It is the sound of no longer needing to prove, the relief of finally being enough, not because we've earned it, but because we've stopped resisting the truth that we always were. And this is where his bleakness turns to balm, where his despair turns to depth. Because once we accept the unchangeable nature of the world, we are free to change how we meet it. And that shift, subtle, internal, often invisible, is the foundation of a different kind of life. Not louder, but more alive. Not more successful, but more sincere. And sincerity, in a culture of masks, is a kind of rebellion. A quiet refusal to participate in the charade of perpetual progress. And this refusal is not cynical, but sacred, because it makes room for what is real, for what aches and what heals, for what cannot be monetized or measured but still matters deeply, like the way a child reaches for your hand, or the way grief softens into memory, or the way two people can sit in silence and still feel seen. And none of this is efficient, none of this is productive, but all of it is true. And truth, for Schopenhauer, was never negotiable, because to build a life on falsehood, however comforting, is to live in exile from oneself. And exile is the root of so much of our pain. Not the pain of loss, but the pain of pretending, of hiding, of shrinking ourselves to fit a story that was never ours. And so he invites us, again and again, to come home. Not to a place, but to a posture, a way of meeting the world with eyes open, heart open, hands open, ready not to grasp but to receive. And receiving in this sense is not passive, it is courageous, because it means we are willing to take life as it is, without demanding it justify itself. And in that acceptance we find not answers, but anchoring. Not control, but connection. And connection, true connection, is what we are all aching for, even when we chase it in the wrong places, even when we disguise it as ambition or lust or certainty, because beneath all our striving is the simple need to be seen, to be known, to be held in our fullness and told. Not that it will all be okay, but that we are not alone in the not okay. And that is what Schopenhauer offered. Not a cure, but a companion. Not a way out, but a way through. And for those who are tired of pretending, who are ready to live in the rawness of what is, his words are not a wall, but a doorway. And through that doorway is not light or darkness, but something quieter and more human. The soft, steady rhythm of a life lived honestly.